Well, do violent video games cause violence?
Underlying fear expressed by parents during public hearings that video games lead to violence.
The gun violence has more to do with video game weapons than real ones.
Are they going to become violent just by playing Grand Auto Theft and Halo and these games?
There's been plenty of research out there which shows a link between violent video games and aggression.
Violent video games increase aggressive behavior.
These video games, to me, are murder simulators, is what they are. And
he was trained to kill with Call of Duty and other video games.
There has always been a war against the next big thing or new craze. There are plenty of people that will agree with it, but there are many that will go against it. There are plenty of people that will not accept the new idea or concept, from even as far back as the 1st century, when the concept of Christianity arose, and the Roman Empire banned this new feared religion, and even in the 4th century, when Aristotle had claimed that the earth was round, and his theory was rejected by those that thought the world was flat. There will always be something in the world that people believe is ruining society.
Centuries ago, it was the pamphleteers who were scolded for dragging down society. In the 50s, it was comic books, and in the 60s, it was the Beatles.
This brings me to the topic of violence in video games, one of the most discussed ethical topics within the realm of video games. The argument begins at the question, should we allow violent video games in our society? There exists a large group of individuals that believe that these video games should not be allowed due to their violent nature and their capability to incite violence within children. This group tends to consist of older individuals who are not a part of the video game culture and do not play video games.
What is it called? Art of War, Man of War? What do the kids play?
I don't know anything about the dopey game. I don't do this kind of stuff.
Their reasoning includes citing studies done showing the correlation between playing violent games and violent thoughts within children. They also claim that playing these violent games can turn you into a killer, that violent games can somehow teach you how to be a murderer. Their beliefs are that playing games that involve the use of weapons can train a person to use these weapons. The idea that a game can teach you how to handle weapons as though you've trained with them in reality is ridiculous. Using a gun in game does not teach you how to fire and or handle a gun, just as cooking in a game does not teach you how to be a chef, or how managing a business in game does not make you better at running a business. So what about the point that video games incite a killing intent within people? Can this really be true? Well, it turns out it's not. There are still no studies that have conclusive evidence for video games causing people to become violent. Studies do, however, point to violent games promoting violent thoughts for a short period of time after playing the game. But the same could be said about any other media. Reading a sad book would most likely make you feel sad after you read it, but we don't say that sad books lead to depression. But there is an issue with reviewing these studies, and that issue is that these studies done on controversial topics such as this one are subject to something called publication bias. Publication bias states that studies that end with positive results can end up being easier to publish than those that bring back negative results. This would mean that just looking at these studies done would give a biased outlook on the topic. In 2007, Christopher Ferguson published a meta-analysis of the studies of violence in video games and found significant evidence of publication bias. This would mean that studies done on this topic are more likely to be published if they concluded that violent video games did cause violence. This causes a bias on the results of these studies. Christopher Ferguson went even further and produced his own study. He looked at 103 young adults who were randomized to play no video game, a non-violent game, a violent game where they played as the good guy, and a violent game where they played as the bad guy. He then asked them to perform a frustrating task, one that would be likely to frustrate them and then cause them to become violent. The study ended up showing no link between the violent games and aggression. He did, however, find that those kids who had a history of playing violent video games had fewer hostile feelings during the frustration test. Moreover, in 2012, another study was conducted on more than 6,500 eighth graders, where they controlled for outside factors that could affect the subject's emotions. When they did control these factors, they found that the association between video games and behavior became even smaller. Now, amongst the talk of studies and people's beliefs, we should stop and take a moment to see what the government thinks about games that are ruining our children. Well, it actually seems that the majority of those within the government are in agreement that these video games are fine just how they are. Ever since the addition of the rating system on games, most, if not all, other proposed laws have been unsuccessful in passing.
Along with California, 9 other states passed laws banning the sale of violent video games to children, but legal challenges stopped any of those laws from ever taking effect.
Most of the justices really thought this law is too vague. It can be too broadly applied and would be too onerous both on the game developers, the game publishers, and too restrictive for, First Amendment rights of even the minors.
Now I must finally answer the question: are violent video games ethical? I believe that they are ethical, and would even say that censoring these games would be considered unethical. Violent video games are a positive for society because they give people that play them a way to channel their emotions into something that won't harm others. Violent games also consist of a large portion of the revenue made in the gaming industry, meaning that censoring or restricting these games would harm the overall productivity of society.